Hello everyone, this is Tristan McGough, your philosopher at large, and today we are in session 6 of Selfology 101, in which we are considering the 5th of the fundamental intuitional ideas, in which we all habit as a foundation of our very being. These 5 ideas, this 5th of the 7 ideas, is going to be the self for itself. That is, the self as we usually think of it in terms of myself, yourself, his self, their self. We're thinking there of a psychological entity. And that's where most people begin in their consideration of the self. But as you can see in the 7 intuitional ideas of self, which are the primary ontological arrangement of the self, we all have these ideas at all times, everywhere, under all circumstances, although we may not be liminally, that is, tentatively, aware of it. And part of the mastery of being, of course, is becoming aware of that. So today, what we're going to look at, besides, as we've already considered, the self as all itself, that is, the one and only, sole and single, all and everything, something that is anything of being, finite being, non-being, and conscious being. It's whatever you can throw into that ontological hopper, that is the all itself. That's our first conception, if you will, or expression today of what is a fundamental intuition. That is the way that we view the world from our own perspective. So we do see the self as all and everything. But at the same time, we see the self as the only thing. It's the only thing of which there is a unit. Everything else is contained in that single unit. This idea, this cosmological or ontological idea of self, is something which we can term the only itself. That's the self as only itself. And of course, then there's the self as what is reality. That's the self as itself, in which we have an all-mirroring comprehension or consciousness of what really is the case. And there, of course, we discussed what goes into the composition of as itself. When you look at reality, what is it? It's 4 ingredients. It's pure being. It's that being as it becomes divided into finite being, by conscious being, through non-being. Because you can't be everything all at once and participate in the finite world, but the finite world itself has to be a nexus of completeness, which takes us into the self as in itself, where you have the macrocosmic whole, of which there are microcosmic parts, such as myself, yourself, their self, even other things that we can point to and reify it in terms of saying, well, this is a table, and this is a pointer, and this is a ring, etc. Today we're going to consider the self for itself. It's an existentialist term, of course. Looking at the individual existential entity, the human being, and what actually goes into the composition of a human being. So that'll take us into the province of psychology and beyond, into cognology. Now, just by way of a forecast, we'll be looking at the self into itself. That is the pilgrim, the psychonaut. We're all travelers in development, unfoldment, and achievement. All these intuitional ideas of self, they do not happen in phases. You do not get to the phase where you become a pilgrim. You're already a pilgrim. You're a samsaran. You're caught in the web of cyclic existence. That is, the finite world of cause and effect, of time, of space, of entities, interacting energies. And then there's the self that eventually achieves complete awakening and complete happiness in this life. That is, the for itself that travels into itself and achieves the by itself. That is where it realizes as consciousness the very nature of its being as conscious being. So today, we're going to begin with something that I have not religiously done before, and that is read through these insights into the self as cognos. And actually, when you're looking at the self as a synergetic self, as a complete self, all dynamically interacting, a moving arrangement of parts in the ephemeral moment of the eternal now, that's cognology. That's the study of cognos. And in another series, we will be developing cognology as its own separate study. But for now, we're placing it, if you will, within this diadem of 7 intuitional ideas as pristine cognitions. They arise naturally, forming one's idea of self. Cicero said, "Why do you insist the universe is not a conscious intelligence when it gives birth to conscious intelligences?" That's quite an insight. Xenophanes, who lived maybe 5 centuries earlier, said the whole sees, the whole perceives, the whole hears. In the Kabbalion, their first principle of mentalism states the all is mind. The universe is mental. And Kashmiraja, who is a Shaivite Kashmiri thinker, states awareness, free and independent, is the cause of the performance of everything. In fact, that's the opening sutra of his 20 sutras, recognition sutras. Edward Schrödinger, who is the founder of quantum mechanics, said subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of recent experience in the physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist. In other words, there's something, a monacity, if you will, as a term, that unifies subject and object. Otherwise, one could not be a complement to the other. They're both co-founded and they're co-relational. And the great polymath, George Spencer Brown, stated, "Now, the physicist himself, who describes all this, the world, is, in his own account, himself constructed of it. He is, in short, made of a conglomeration of the very particles he describes, no more, no less, bound together by and obeying such general laws as he himself has managed to find and to record. Thus, we cannot escape the fact that the world we know is constructed in order, and thus in such a way, as to be able to see itself. This is indeed amazing. Not so much in view of what it sees, although this may appear fantastic enough, but in respect of the fact that it can see it all. In other words, The universe as being holds within its potentiality the ability to see itself, and that's conscious being. Conscious being is another word for experience, which is divided into the experiencer and the experienced, and that's connected through the experiencing. We can also look at it as the knower, knowing, and the known. That is, there is always the subject of experience, and there's the object of experience. But there's that factor that binds the two into something new. Because if the subject were merely passive and the object remained and did not influence in any way the subject, there would be no arising in the subject's mind of an object. And that can be an internal object, such as an awareness of a feeling that you have. We're not aware of all of our feelings. We don't bring them liminally to the surface. They remain subliminal. But nonetheless, they're energetically and dynamically active in forming our dispositions and our interaction with the world. In terms of experiencing, these are the transfinite fields of knowing. And transfinity is, if you will, the shaping of infinity into finity, into finite things. It's a process. And it's a correlational process. It's not something that's static. It's not a faculty. It's something that the universe inherently does or intrinsically is in terms of conscious being as being that is a subject that beholds objects. That beholding is the interject. That's the transfinite world. The infinite world is with infinite possibilities, and it's pre-constructed, it's undefiled, it's undefined, it's the ground of everything from which finite being takes shape. But the shaper is conscious being. And when conscious being shapes being, they leave out a lot. And that's nothingness. And there are many kinds of nothingness, as we've discussed, that is part of what it means to be an entity. Because this is not my ring, and it's not my eyeball, it's something that is an object. Not just that I behold, but it's part of an objective stream of things that are occurring at all times. It doesn't mean that we always grasp it directly, because in the empirical world, everything is causation. It's produced, which means one thing leads to another. The photons impacting on my retina and the image that's transmitted as chemical, electrical signals to my brain where it's rearranged and it takes form. It all takes form because there's consciousness which is clear and allows it to take shape. That's the first thing. Consciousness is pure. It's pristine. But it's also spontaneous. And the very causation that happens by way of producing a sense of objectivity or that there's an object there is part of being. It's part of conscious being. So in terms of what we are considering as what consciousness is, let's take a look at the four primary processes around intuiting. Intuiting is true knowing. We often think that knowing is a kind of thinking. Propositionally, I'm going to prove this or that or the other thing. And so I make a statement, and I have premises, and there's a conclusion, which is an inference from the above, according to logical rules. And those can vary, of course, according to which set of principles you're using of logic. But those are all logical things that occur with thinking. Intuiting is when you know that you are thinking. When you know you're thinking a particular subject, whether it's mathematics, whether it's chemistry, whether it's world events. Those thoughts are your thinking. Intuiting is your self's consciousness as consciousness, knowing directly that you're thinking, knowing directly your thoughts. Your thoughts may be mistaken, but you know your mistaken thoughts directly. And what makes a mistake is that that thought can be corrected, rectified to correspond to reality, which means that you've reshaped that thought, you've transformed it. Or you can keep that thought frozen and interpret the rest of the world according to just this one picture frame. So anyway, thinking is not the same as knowing or intuiting. Because intuiting, you can intuit what you resolve and intend, what you will. You know when you will something. When you're feeling, such as when you're elated or when you're depressed. You know you're elated or that you're depressed. When sensing the outside world vitally through action or passively through some kind of perception, whether it's hearing or taste, whatever. You know it's you doing the sensing. It's your sense of smell, your sound that you interpret. So intuiting actually is the way in which willing, thinking, feeling, and sensing all take shape. Consciousness in the self, if we were to put it and say, well, self-consciousness includes the self-intuiting what? The will, and all it's willing, the mind, and here's one definition of the mind, right? We can use several different definitions of the mind. It can cover 97 different categories. But here, the category I want you to use is that it applies to thinking as opposed to feeling, doing, or willing. So the self has life, will, mind, and, if you will, love. You can call it the heart if you want. It's the feeling aspect. Doing, willing, thinking, feeling, those are all directly intuitable within your own self-consciousness. This is a quick review of some things that we've talked about, but this is, if you will, the arrow that leads on the arc of cognology. So as we've already covered, the aeonocosms, the tricosm that is, the macrocosm, the microcosm, and the minicosm are all themselves part of the one individuality, what we've called the aeon, and that is the self as only itself. It's a single unit. Nothing can escape reality. You can't have some part of reality explained if you have to go beyond reality to explain it. Everything has to be self-contained in that unit, and that's the idea of the tricosm. It's the full unified field. It's the whole pulsating sphere of reality. However, there's an identity as a unitive string, which is, if you will, a vibrating axis of I am I that permeates the macrocosm, the microcosm, that is you, I, and others, and the minicosm, whether it's ourselves or if you wish to look at the atomic nature and subatomic nature of what constitutes the cells. Each one of those are along a hierarchy of the macrocosm and the microcosm and the minicosms which constitute that. How infinitesimally small you can go, there is no limit. How infinitesimally large, that is in terms of an infinitude of finite things you can expand, there is no limit. That's not the same thing as infinity that has no boundaries, such as space, when we consider it as infinity, or time, when we consider it as eternity, or when we consider our various feelings as part of the totality. These are all very different ways in which we already participate in being at, if you will, a universal level and a particular level. It's not one or the other. And this is what we are showing in terms of as we are going to be discussing with the triliminality of consciousness, which occurs naturally along the axis of identity of the microcosmic self. This is the self, which we usually speak of when we're talking about ourselves. However, I have a very expanded definition of what constitutes this particular microcosmic self. It's not simply the area that psychology investigates with the empiric self and the personae of the personality, that is the various roles and faces that we use to interact with the rest of the world. Behavioral psychology deals with the existential realm and the mechanical nature of the organic being. Deeper psychology that attempts to account for the various parameters of your full psychic life in terms of your affections, your attachments, your organization of your worldview, your experience of things mentally. These are all part of various aspects of whether it's cognitive psychology or your typical textbook psychology as it ranks the various individual types and attempts to discover what are the psychical processes that go into the psyche of an individual. However, as Maslow and others who have spearheaded the humanity's thinking have indicated, there is an agnostic self, the spiritual self, the pneuma. And that is a universal area where all of us, again, participate in as part of reality. It's not something we have to achieve. It's something which fundamentally we are. And these things that fundamentally we are, as we've discussed in terms of cognos or consciousness, our existence is really a consideration of what? It's a condensation of omniscience, the omniscience of intelligence, conscience, sentience, and vivacience, that sense of life that we all have. That is the dynamism, the very energy. The very energy that we experience of life is quite different than the thinking that we have about that energy. And it's quite different than the feelings that we have because of that energy. That's all doing. Even our resolutions, our intentions that we shall do such and such, all part of our conscience as along this axis of willing. All of that. It's energy. It has a vivacience. It has a vibratory level, tone, and amplitude, if you will, that differs. In a way, conscience differs than sentience and intelligence and vivacience, which itself, as vivacience, is connected to this very concrete world. The archaic self is the one self. I've divided it into spirit and soul and soma. That is a tripartite division that is cross-cultural. It's what we call a transcultural paradigm. It doesn't matter where you go in an explanation, a religious explanation of the cosmos, as explaining the big picture. You always have a trinity, of spirit, of soul, of soma. Sometimes it's called spirit, mind, body. Sometimes it's called soul, mind, body. It's been called and arranged different ways in different times, in different translations. None of that matters. You can make a commensurable understanding from one term to the other. Very simply, the empiric self, when you unpack it, includes the empirical ego. Everything that you experience as a knower by apprehension. It is your experiential sensibilities. You have limited agency. As an ego, you can only do so much. You have sequential time. You're caught in a finite sequence of time. You have desire or craving. It isn't as if you can enjoy all of the world at once. You enjoy this particular cupcake, that particular meal, that odor, that sunset, this conversation with so-and-so. Whatever, you have particular desires. All of these things you'll see in terms of your experiential sensibilities, they're all finite, they're all limited. So you have limited knowledge. None of us know everything. Who was it? Sophocles. No man can know everything. And localized causality. It isn't as if when I drop something, it's going to fall anywhere except according to the local circumstances of the causal laws in which these entities, the ground, this pointer, the law of gravitation, all of it is involved. It's localized. In terms of our psychological capacities of the empiric self, the personality, that usually is what is the object of study for modern day psychology. The psychological capacities, you see yourself and then you see the rest of the world as an it. Those who are close to you, you see as thou. You see as somebody important. You see as somebody who's commensurable to yourself. You give them that due respect, that due regard. You behold them as an equal to yourself. There's also technique. Technique, that is your creative skills. Just like philia are your social skills. And sophos, those are your cognitive skills. And phronesis, they're your pragmatic skills. It's the ability to use a spoon, a fork, to twirl a pointer, what have you. And I've put those in these terms of personal capabilities. You have your reflective skills, your creative skills, your pragmatic skills, your social skills, and your cognitive skills. In terms of your personality measures, there are 5 groupings that psychologists today have resolved pretty well as being the kind of baskets you can group human behavior in. And that's in terms of extroversion. That is, your outgoingness to the world, your sense of dominance, your ability to penetrate the world, to control and organize it. Neuroticism, that is your fear of the world. You feel as a separated individual who may have anxieties and worries, and you cope with that internally in strange ways in order to maintain some kind of balance in the world. When it becomes too disoriented, of course, you suffer various neurotic or psychotic forms of psychopathology. And in terms of the conscientiousness, that's how well you do things when you pay particular attention to tasks. Are you industrious and diligent? Do you pay attention to what you're doing? Do you make sure that you get the job done appropriately? Can people rely on you? Agreeableness, that is, how well can you interact with another warmly? Are you offensive? Are you abrasive? Are you toxic? If you are, you have less agreeableness than somebody who isn't. In terms of openness, that's the creative side of each of us. We have, first of all, an openness, a sense of adventure and discovery in the world, and we're open to not only trying new things, but first and primarily to thinking new things and to feeling new things. Then when we come to the epistic self, what we call the psyche, in the same way that this is the person, this entire group with the objective senses. You got your 5, let's sum up here. You have your 5 passive senses, right? Hearing, smelling, etc. You have your 5 active senses, which are locomotion, manipulation, digestion, regeneration, and speech, vocalization. All right. When it comes to the psyche as the second of the trigonic self, sections or parts, and you consider it as a self even in itself, because that's exactly what psychology does. They consider the person without regard to what we're now going to talk about, which even existentialists, when they're understanding the transcendental ego, they understand. that provides the formative apparatus by which sense is made of the world and interpretations are given. With the transcendental ego, there's continuity and transcendence. There's the integrity of consciousness, and there's the epistemic relation that takes place primarily between the I and the me. The first kind of causation that is present within the empiric self and by which it's constructed is production, cause and effect, consequence and result. Here in the realm of psyche, it is generation. It is where the self generates, for instance, a thought or a feeling. It doesn't happen anywhere else. It's intra-agent causality. Out here in this world, it's inter-agent causality. I interact with things. I move things around. In intra-agent causality, it's all a question of the generator and the generated, the I and the me. And so every time that you think, you try to catch hold of yourself, you say, well, I'm a rather jolly person, or I'm pretty intelligent. However you want to assess yourself, however you conclude that you are, you've generated part of the me. And when you look at it, it's no longer the I that's being seen, it's the me that's projected from you, the I. That's all generation. That's generative causality. And here, and that's part of experiencing. That's your stream of consciousness that's going on right now. And you have as an egoity your I maker. That is, every time that you have a particular thought or feeling, it's you who made the thought. That's what I'm talking about in terms of the epistemic relation. The epistemic relation is subject-object correlation. It's always there. At the level of the psyche, that is the determining kind of causality, that you generate your own effects from within. It has nothing to do with the person or the empiric self. You can divorce yourself from that in terms of quelling the body, the feelings, the concrete thoughts, so that you settle. And that's what happens in meditation. It's a settling of all those. And it's a release of those. It's a pratyahara. You turn your attention away from the empiric self and all the finite considerations, finite thoughts, finite feelings, finite discriminations or resolutions, all of it in meditation is suspended. And you enter into the psyche where you have the liminal experiencing consciousness with subliminal and supraliminal constructs. You can at that point see very clearly what is subliminal to you and that you've repressed or don't call upon. We'll consider triliminality in a moment. But that's what allows you to entertain things that you've experienced as well as to experience the basic energies that are the foundation of your being that are ever present. They're already here with us. And that's what we're speaking about in terms of pneuma. But anyway, the psyche is the self-transformer. Because here, all your ideas, your feelings, your doings, the things that you do, whether they're mental, whether they're physical, whether they're emotional, all that energy expended, all of that is occurring within here as noia, that is, as contents of consciousness or experience. Remember the experiencing we were speaking about earlier in our chart, that central column, all of that is included there. At the same time, I'm having feelings and thoughts and willings and doings, as are you. They're all being intuited by me from my central self where I develop reflective skills. So, the psyche is the self-transformer. It's there that consciousness picks itself up by its bootstraps reflectively and begins consciously the journey of a psychonaut. Although we're all psychonauts all along, we are all developing our psyche. And the basic self is the agnostic self. All three of these, agnostic, epistic, and empiric, they are all equally important. It is not as if we are trying to escape from one to the other, or we're trying to isolate ourselves in meditation and just the psyche, or we're trying to transcend both the psyche and the person by becoming pure spirit through a yoga of cessation, where we are going to abandon all the causes that would ever pull us back into being. Although that's a possibility. But in terms of omniphilosophy and its development of the individual conscious being to become by itself, that is, parousia, to become the full fruition of what consciousness is, in order for that to occur, you must move beyond the limitations of the finite world. You must move beyond the trans-finite world of your own innerscape. And you end up appreciating the entirety of life through your intuitive senses, your axiomatic sense of conscious certainty, the self-evident certainties that you experience as a self-referential, self-reflective, recursive being, a conscious being, capable of projecting their thoughts as a me. The archaic sense is your sense of truth. Your archaic sense or moral sense is conscience. It's your sense of what is good. Your aesthetic sense is a sense of what is beautiful, because what is true is sensed by the mind. What is beautiful is sensed by the heart or through love. What is good is sensed by the conscience or the archaic, the ethical or moral sense. And what is powerful, what is power, is sensed by, of all the senses, the vivacious. You know power as you feel power, as you surge power, as power drives you. All these three selves, agnostic, epistic, and empiric, all three selves working together as one, is the trinity we call the trigonic self. The trigonic self is also the archaic self, which means the one self. It's your one self. It's you as a microcosm, complete and single and soul. As a microcosm, doesn't mean you don't interact. Now we come to triliminal consciousness, which allows the trigonic formation to take shape into the three selves we've mentioned, from the agnostic through the epistic, through the empiric, the finite, the transfinite, and the infinite. Very shortly, excuse me. Recovering from a cold. Very briefly, in terms of our liminal consciousness, that is the consciousness in which we usually say we're paying attention. That is attention. Everything that's happened in supraliminal consciousness, we apperceive. We know what's going on at our deepest level in terms of our supraliminal consciousness. Why we're not liminally aware of it is of necessity, because we are operating in the finite world that utilizes the principle of utility. Everything has a use. That's what cause and effect is. Everything has a use value. And so we're always looking for one way or another not to pay attention to everything at once, because remember, all three of yourselves, your spiritual, your solar, and your somatic selves, that is, your pneuma, your psyche, and your person, your personality, all three of them as they participate within the infinite, transfinite, and finite worlds. It's unified. At the very moment that I am having the apprehension of this particular piece of philosophical art, the moment that I'm apprehending it as a finite object through my finite senses, I'm also experiencing it as a transfinite experience of union, of fusion. It is not just a piece of finite material, it is a representation. It represents certain things that are occurring internally. So although I attempt to represent the mind aspect and say, well, in terms of triliminal consciousness here, right here, the liminal consciousness that we're talking about includes what? It includes the ahamkarik, that is the I maker. Everything you're doing, right, every time that you're conscious and you pay attention, you're the I maker. You have a feeling, you have a thought, you have a perception, you have an angle on this, you have a viewpoint. All of that is made from the center of your conscious experience as a liminal beam. That's the ahamkara, liminality. When it comes to what you're attentive to, now remember this, finite things you apprehend. Attention is transfinity. There's nothing to do with you apprehending something. That's why you train yourself in meditation to sustain thought on an object, for instance, on a candle flame to begin with. Because everything down here as a finite thing is always shifting, it's always changing. However, you try to pay attention to it as a finite thing, and you'll see that your transfinite psyche can weave it, it can leave it, it can concentrate on it to the point where it becomes stuporous and falls asleep. All of that is attention. It's triliminal consciousness as we know it, and we termed it liminal consciousness. Attention is liminal consciousness. So when you're paying attention to something, you have voluntary will, and you have aware or open or psychic experiences. That is, you know that you know at the moment. And you also have things presented to you, presential. And those are the feelings that you own right in the moment concretely. And then there is kinesic, part of the vivations. The kinesic part is your doing. When you're liminally aware, you are doing something and you're aware of what you're doing. So that's all liminal. But you have many things that are subliminal that you do not readily recall, and you push them down through pain or in some other way they're inaccessible. These are inaccessible parts of your subliminal consciousness, some of it which arises during psychotherapy or through meditation or just through living and reflection. However, there may be very deep inaccessible parts that are best left alone until being able to appropriately deal with the energies that are released, as every therapist would caution you on. Nevertheless, in the same way that in your subliminal consciousness, you have these very deep, repressed, inaccessible elements, you also have a whole range of things that, if you will, are pre-conscious, they're preliminal, such as your ability to use language or numbers. You don't have to, in the very moment, know the whole and recite the entire encyclopedia in order to use language. Whatever you have by way of your developmental linguistic capabilities are always readily at hand in your innerscape. And this is what we call the preconscious. And that's part of your subliminal awareness. Once you've learned how to ride a bike, doesn't mean because you're sitting in a chair in a moment you forgot how to ride a bike. It's preconscious, subliminal. In the same thing, in the same vein, if you will, let us consider supraliminal consciousness. Supraliminal consciousness are these very things, for instance, the five senses we talked about. Your axiomatic sense, that is, you just can't shake the feeling that you're real. That's your axiomatic sense. Your archaic sense. You have a certain moral sense of purpose in the world and your place within it. These are all foundational. As your etheric senses, that is, you have a natural appetite or drive to discover and be curious about the world, to know the truth, how things really are, the correspondence between your ideas and the world objectively out there, as it's so framed and conventionally understood. Nonetheless, you do have that. We all have that drive in order to do that. And in the same way, all these aspects that we have in terms of the supraliminal, we all share. We all have a sense of beauty. Now, the way that you experience finitely that sense of beauty is dependent upon your transfinite innerscape boundaries. What do you desire, right? It's limited desire, it's limited knowledge, it's limited action, it's limited scope in terms of will of what you can and cannot achieve. But triliminal consciousness allows the liminality of your attention and the subliminality of all the things you've apprehended, plus the apperception, that is the clear intuition of all the objects of your consciousness, all the contents of your consciousness. You know these as elements of yourself. Very quickly, if we were to look upon the various planes of being, of which that trigonic self is stretched, as it were, we could begin, first of all, take a look at this pyramid, and imagine that that's exactly what this is here, this physical pyramid. And then next there's a larger pyramid, and that's the emotive realm, your realm of feelings, affectations, dreams. Then there's the mentosphere, where you have your concrete and abstract thoughts. Then there's the egoic pyramid. And the egoic pyramid is where you have that I maker that is always generating to me and everything about it. It's my thoughts, it's my feelings, etc. And then you have its reflection in the finite world, which is able to integrate and apprehend things at a finite level. It doesn't just treat them as part of the innerscape, it treats them part of a finite world in which it's integrated as a psychophysical organism, the finite world. And so what I've done is I've looked at that and taken it and said, listen, if we were to go and we were to break all these pyramids up, and then after the egoic you have the intuitive, pardon my divagation, the intuitive realm, and that in theosophical language is the Buddhic realm. It's the realm of where you have these extraordinary capacities we've talked about, the axiomatic, the archaic, the alethic, the aesthetic, and the authentic, which is the sense of power, that you are generating your own action. And that is all within the intuitive realm. And then there's the cognal realm, where basically we have the intentionalities, if you will. They're the way that consciousness fashions its foundational framework. There is apperception where it always knows what it's doing. It's standing right at the center. And because there is this apperception and everything, whether it's happening in the personality or the psyche or the pneuma, is understood at that level, it is all integrated cognostically at the level of the monad, where you exist as a complete being that is infinite, in that you operate with the very same infinite energies that are operating throughout the universe. It is transfinite, in which it is your unique interscape that you generate in the I-me epistemic relation. And you are empirically involved within the finite world, the world of individuated and particular sights and sounds and smells and tastes and touches. What we are dealing with when we speak of that, all the seven pyramids, and the greater, including the lesser, is, of course, we're talking about the cognography of human existence and all 7 planes and 14 subplanes, leading from the physical through the emotive, the mental, the egoic, the intuitive, cognal, and aeonal, which is essentially the infinite. It's here where the 5 basic energies, the hypostases, the basis, better word, the basis, the 5-fold basis of consciousness, which is, as we've talked about it, ipsitas, that's the I as I. It's nisus, that's your essential will power. Aesthesis, that's the essential ability to have affects and to be sensitive to the world. Cognosis, which is where you understand mentally and can comprehend things in the world. And vivus, which is this dynamic life energy which is spontaneously and ever arising. And all of these are the various aspects, the ideations of consciousness, as these are the fields of being in which it moves and lives and has its being. For those of the Buddhist tradition and of yogic lineage, the ideations of parousia are actually referred to as minds, and they ride upon the winds, the fields of ousia. So we're dealing with the entire map, if you will, of human existence. When we're speaking of cognology, we're not just talking about the mental apparatus of the individual and the emotional reactions and the vital organization of the physical body. We're talking about it all. Pardon me. When we're speaking about consciousness, we've referred to it many times in terms of the 10 dimensions of self. And very quickly, that's your bodily self, your perspectival self, your emotional self, your narrative self, your volitional self, social self, enduring self, unitary self or organizing self, your advancing self, which is ever presenting the entire world complete, both finitely and transfinitely, and of course, the identifying self, which is the one self. That's the self as ontogenetically actuating and transparently sensing all the other 9 dimensions of self, which I've conveniently put into a star, and I've dimensionalized it in terms of gnosic emanation, and that is what really is focused within pneuma, or the spiritual realm. Well, that's the one self, which is the identifying dimension, as well as your advancing self, which is the presenting dimension and allows the complete triliminality to take place. In terms of epistemic generation, which is the second type of causation, the first being production, second generation, and the third is emanation, where things are emergent from potentiated being. In terms of generation itself, we see that we have an enduring self, and that's where we list the volitional, emotional, narrating, and the organizing selves. So all 5 of those are included, and there are 3 existential positions, if you will, of consciousness in terms of obvious, the bodily self, another, the perspectival self that you take upon the world, even upon your inner world. It's the way that you individuate things as a perspective into finite sections and scenes and spans of time and series of cause and effects. That is, this continuum of space-time entity and causation in each of our worlds, all of our worlds in the only world. And then there's the social dimension, which is your imaging dimension. And that allows you to take images, which are what? They're finite representations of reality. And that's all that they are. And to manipulate them so that you can angulate. And you can see yourself from other people's perspective. You can see yourself as maybe your mother might see you, or as a friend might see you, etc. But these 10 dimensions are involved in tricausality. And so you've got to remember that they're involved in all the dimensions. The 10 dimensions are involved within all the dimensions of being. So the 10 dimensions of consciousness, although they have a particular relationship here, as I've indicated, they signify so much more in terms of participating within the entire cognos, the entire consciousness of one's being. I've laid them into a list, a columnated form, if you will, a table. And here under Gnostic emanation, which is trans-agent causality, it's good across the board. It's universal. It isn't as if it's located causality, as happens here in empiric production, through interagent causality. Nor is it intra-agent causality, where it affects only the psychical causation of myself, or you in your instance of yourself. Those are all accounted for in terms of your enduring self and your organizing self, and of course the emotional, narrating, or thinking, and volitional or willing self. In terms of your empiric production, that is, what participates in the ecologue between you and the world, there are 3 dimensions. The perspectival self, that's the view that you take upon the world in terms of your beliefs, your habits, your sentiments, your commitments, and so much more. But you take it from a perspective where you occupy a point from which you view the world. And then there's the bodily self, which is involved through the various passive organs and the various active organs with the materiality of this world. And the bodily self, as well, in terms of cognology, are the other bodies that you inhabit, including your emotive body, including your mentive body, including your egoic body. These are all vehicles in which your faculties and processes operate. However, they transpire, and none of them last forever. So we have the social self then, which takes these individuated images and allows us to transpose them and through them act as windows to reality of the way other beings are sensing us. Let us take those 10 dimensions, and in there we see the self as the crucible of experience in which all of what we've talked about, all of the mind, all of the will, all of your doings, your life, all of your love in your heart, your feelings, all of it, as well as what you sense in the world with your body through your 5 active and 5 passive senses or more, plus your agency as being an actor as well as a watcher, a doer. as well as an observer. All of these are experiences that you have as Deixia, as the one who is generating your thoughts, your feelings, your resolutions. We can look at the 10-dimensional self as the crucible of experience that we started off with. The experiencing of telia, that is of everything that relates to your will, and of logia, of everything that relates to your mind, qualia, everything that relates to your feelings, and avidya, everything that relates to your sense of dynamic livingness. All of those are happening within the crucible of experience. The 10-dimensional self is also the creator of the trigonic self and its triliminality. So here you have all the 10 dimensions feeding into and developing this gnosic self, the central part of liminality, which is our psyche that we're paying attention to, and we can at times, and that becomes attentive. And of course, our empiric self, which is involved within the finite world. And we can see the 10-dimensional self as well as the cauldron of the microcosmic trinity. That is where you as deity, as human, and as creature, that is as body, as mind, and as spirit or soul, however you wish to divide it, as the gnosic self, as the epistic self, as the empiric self. That is the cauldron of the microcosmic trinity, in which you develop yourself as a hero, and as a regent, as a seer, and as a lover. And at the center, of course, stands you, the mystic yogin. Through the cauldron and the crucible and the creation of the trigonic self, we end up in the finite world with an orchestra of personae. These are the various elements of your personality that are interfacing with the world. They're not your internal states. There's the way or the face that you as a soul put on in the personality to adapt to the world. And you adapt to general categories to begin with, such as you have a filial persona, the way you interact with your parents, the way you, and then each one of these, remember, can be subcategorized. So there's a way that you'll treat your parents when they're together. This is your filial personae. When it's more than one, such as toward your mother you will act one way, toward your father you'll act another way, and perhaps when both parents are together, you act in a truly above filial fashion. And in the same way you develop sibling personae, depending on whether you have one sibling or several. You will individuate, and these will become, but as overall, you will treat your siblings different, with a different persona, a different role, because you play a different role, and the personae is the matchmaking of your personality in that social context of playing that role. So you'll have one in terms of sibling persona, and another in terms of extended family persona. You'll have many friends. They'll be arranged, if you will, in concentric circles, from your most intimate to those which are merely acquaintances, and those are your friends' personae. Then you have a school or an academic personae that you develop. You see, each of these personae are developed in concrete contexts. They're developed within the finite world as an adaptive response of the conscious being to its environment through the ecologue. In the same way that internally in your innerscape you have an egologue. You're constantly dialoguing with yourself. We all do. You dialogue with the outside world in all your interactions, from eating to bumping, to traveling over the road. That's all part of your ecologue. And basic to both of those at the emanative level of spirit is your ensilog. It is the foundational syllables in speech we all share, as we are all soundings in the one reality. Besides that, you have a peer group persona, and then you have religious persona, the way that you approach God. You have, of course, your various civic persona. You may have one when you're attending a ball game, your favorite recreational sport. You may have a different civic persona when you're at a political rally. So, these are various ways that publicly you use a face. Not a mask, a face. A mask is when you solidify a persona and you are treating one persona like another. For instance, here's a supervisory persona, an occupational persona. If you have a profession or a vocation, something you're paid for, you're employed at, you have an occupational persona. That's the way you act there on the job. Now, it may be individuated, the way that you will act toward, for instance, your employer rather than another employee. So remember, these personae that I am listing here as part of the orchestra bit of personality are ramified into various sub-personae dependent upon the role that you're playing. And that certainly is true of your socioeconomic class personae. Many people perceive themselves as fully incorporated in a capitalistic consumerist society in which they are ostensibly showing their wares and their wherewithal. And they believe that this is part of what establishes their sense of rising along the socioeconomic ladder by their ostentatious display of wealth. Your social persona is something in which you interact when you first meet somebody. You will exchange with them as a person to person. And again, you have a general way of approaching individuals socially in the world, as you have a political, and if you're a parent, then you have a parental persona. And you know these ramify into personae as you have individual children, and you must individuate your parental persona into various adaptive, effective roles to help in the pedagogy, the raising of and education of your children. You have others. You have a way you interface with God. You have a godly persona. Even if it's denying that there's a God, that's the persona that you're using. Now, what is a false persona? That's a mask. That's where, for instance, if I'm a supervisor, I have a supervisory persona, for instance, on the job. I'm a supervisor. I'm not just an employee. I'm there to be part of the team and to supervise these others. Well, I have a different persona for that than I do for my own occupation, which may be part managerial and doing the books as well or what have you. The supervisory persona, however, if I cloak it that I'm somebody's parent, at that point we've got a problem. If I cloak it that they're my friend and I have a friend persona with them rather than a supervisory one, there's going to be conflict. If I treat them like they're a member of my family or my extended family, there will be conflict, etc. If I treat them like God, there's going to be conflict. The various personae are developed in response to the world. So, they're all adaptive. And it's a personality, if you will, it's a personality orchestra. We put these together into the chakra of consciousness. We're going to see that this is an ontoscape of consciousness. There is an encircled dimensions, depth, and detail of cognos. The circle itself are, if you will, the four ingredients of reality: pure being, finite being, conscious being, and non-being. The star represents the 10-dimensional self interacting and acting as the basis for the development of the mandala, which is your transfinite depth. This is where you have your triliminality, your axial self, the trigonic self, the faculties, processes, states, and contents of consciousness and experience. This is keenly connected to the epistic realm, just as the red is your orchestra pit. That is the personal detail. So here you have your dimensions, your depth of psyche, and the details of your personality. They create the chakra of your consciousness. And if we were to look and say that within the great infinite expanse, the ocean of the circle, we have what we can easily see is the sea of the star, the lake of the mandala, and the pool of the personality and the orchestra. When we operate within our own personality pools depending upon the contingency of finite space and time. When we swim within the lake of our own inner scape, escaping the confines of limiting finite reality, we soar on the skies of transfinity and we move into those dimensions beyond which constitute the star of our individuality, all the way from identity dimension right down to the vitality dimension. We do that through our various types of special intelligences, which are located within the empirical self. The empiric self has visual special intelligence besides the general intelligence. There's visual, verbal, logical, kinesthetic, mechanical, naturalistic, musical, existential, that is life smart, interpersonal, people smart, transpersonal, cosmos smart, and then synthetic, that's unitive smart. Some people know just how to take the right ideas and put their verbal, and they can do math, and then they can make a mechanical model that they engineer, and they can do that all. They use 3 kinds of special intelligence. That's synthetic intelligence. We all do it. We take these various 11 kinds of intelligence, including Cosmos Smart. We all have a sense of the world. We have a worldview, and we develop it together under those synthetic intelligences. In a future program, I will go into the 8 powers of cognition. The 8 powers of cognition. Cognition is the process of consciousness. And for instance, right here in the empiric self, every time that you have a cognition of anything, it is personal, private, phenomenal, possessive, performative, perdurant, peculiar, and plethoric. It's never an incomplete perception. It's all coherent. There may be fuzziness at the fringes, but it's all coherent. It's all plethoric. Being all plethoric, it's an object plenifier. I will discuss during cognology, which will be a future series, the various cognizances that these cognitions have. A cognizance is a state of consciousness, a fixed state of consciousness that occurs as the result of the process of consciousness. So cognizances occur like beads, if you will, on the thread of cognition. So these 12 types of special intelligences have a unique role to play within the chakra of consciousness in that they help shape the persona of the personality. In the same way that the 8 powers of cognition are absolutely crucial in the functioning of each of us as an epistic self-conscious being, whether it's in this existential world or our inner world, outerscape or innerscape. I leave you with a view of the 6 omnicities of nous. Nous is consciousness, pure and simple. And you've often heard the term of omniscience. Well, omniscience, as part of omnicity, is the complete and final knowledge and direct understanding of the macrocosm. Omnidurance is, of course, the corresponding aspect in terms of the eternity of the macrocosm. As omnipresence is, being is omnipresent throughout the macrocosm. There's nowhere where being is not present. And there's nowhere where being is not omnipotent. It's omnipotence. And it is omniscience. Being not only senses itself, it touches itself. Being is in constant contact with itself. And being is forever being creative in terms of omnifacience. It'll never stop creating what it fundamentally and essentially is. So in terms of the modes of nous, I leave you with the Atma as conscious being, where we considered the self as being the identity of Ipsiatus, as well as the mind, the will, the life, and the love. Consciousness includes all 4: willing, thinking, feeling, and doing, as being part of what it knows intuitively. So the next time we are going to launch from omnicity into looking at parousia. That is, we're going to look at the self as the pilgrim, as it moves into itself and energizes, actualizes, realizes, and cultivates its complete conscious being. So, until then, behave when you must, be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.